Hello everybody and welcome to another faction guide on the Historica channel. Today we're going to be looking at Baktria, a great beginner-friendly faction which gives you plenty of resources as well as an interesting army from the very onset. They also offer a very unique campaign experience because their roster is truly a mixture of Eastern and Hellenic worlds colliding. And the way that DEI does it is by offering some very interesting units that are sort of a mix of Greek stability along with a more barbarous intensity and fast-paced gameplay. So without further ado, let's look at the Baktrian start position and check out their early game army. Now, the first thing that you'll notice with this start position is that you have an immense amount of territory at the very beginning of this campaign. And unlike other factions like the Ptolemies and Seleucids or the Romans, where you equally have a large amount of territory, the Baktrians get this territory without the adverse effect of constantly being at war and being a massive target to every faction. The Baktrians actually start out with a relatively mild and peaceful diplomatic standing, so you don't really have to worry too much about constantly being invaded, attacked, or betrayed like the Seleucids or the Ptolemies. No, you can actually grow in peace while simultaneously starting out extraordinarily wealthy. This is really the key to this easy Bactrian start position. It's highly defensive in nature while simultaneously being extremely enriching. Now, you do start out with one war, admittedly, and it's over here. Now, in the vanilla version of the game, these guys are called Arcosia, but here they're the Haruvatis. I'm sure I pronounced that horrible, but regardless, you're at war with this faction, and this is just like a standard Eastern faction. They're not going to attack you with anything particularly powerful. Expect light Persian cavalry as well as early game Persian infantry, which is hardly a challenge to defeat, particularly with the Bactrian roster, which is quite splendid. Let's take a look at it, boys. So, admittedly, on the surface, this might look kind of weak. I mean, you can see on these unit cards there's hardly any armor in sight, but in reality, there's actually some pretty spectacular stats here lurking under the surface. In particular, these Bactrian assault infantry are far stronger than you'd think, and if you look at these stats here and think back to an earlier video, I hope this reminds you of something, because these guys have identical stats to the early game Thracian infantry, the Thracian warriors. And that's the thing, folks. These guys are essentially Greek Thracians. Like, statistically, they're identical, with the exception that these infantry don't have a javelin volley while the Thracians do, but that's irrelevant, guys. You have Thracians here in the Far East, where infantry is typically a little bit weaker than they are, you know, in the Hellenized world. So these guys are going to really punch above their weight. I mean, look at their stats, guys. 10 attack and 10 defense is just simply competent fighting stats. Combine that with 21 charge bonus, which is higher than average, 21 weapon damage, which is amazing for early game, and then a massive 7 armor penetration and 2 bonuses to infantry. Those two stats are going to kind of secretly put these guys up above everything else. Now, they do only have 8 armor, but guys, in this region, there aren't a whole lot of armored infantrymen running around until late game. So this armor is kind of irrelevant. Having 10 or 8 is perfectly acceptable here. So for your early game, for your first army, my recommendation is that you mix these Bactrian infantry, make like a main line of these guys, have a couple of these Sogdian axemen on the flank. These guys are absolute merciless shock infantry. I mean, they have 225 men and 15 attack, almost no armor, but look at that weapon damage, 25, a massive 31 charge bonus, a great 9 armor penetration. Now, the first time I ever played a Bactrian campaign, I did mess up and recruit way too many of these guys. You don't want too many, because they do lack in stability, and once they start dying and routing en masse, you end up getting a little bit screwed. But having somewhere between 2 to 4 of these guys in your initial army is absolutely perfect. Have a main line of these guys, and then for your skirmishers, I would recommend that you stick with these Bactrian slingers. They are slightly more expensive than the other skirmishers on offer, but these skirmishers are pretty much incompetent versions of javelin men and archers. These slingers are actually genuinely decent, so I would stick with the slingers. And yeah, I would mainly just recruit these Baktria and Assault Infantry and Visagi and Axemen. For Cavalry, I'd go with the Javelin option because they have better melee stats than Horse Archers. So you can actually use them for some Hammer and Anvil and stuff like that. Now, with the Baktrians, you do start out with some civic technology unlocked. So you're not going to have your next barrack for at least 10 turns. But once you get it, you unlock a couple other units, such as this Baktrian infantry, which is actually really good, guys. Really, really good. I mean, 8 and 16 is actually quite decent for this part of the game, as well as 25 armor. I would recruit plenty of these Baktrian infantrymen, along with... Let's see, what else did they have here? I mean, do you have Peltis, which pretty cool. I feel like Peltis work pretty well for Baktria, just because you are going to be fighting up against some pretty low-tier infantry, so the Peltis will just disrupt them even further, allowing your infantry to win quicker. Plus, you have shock infantry. I mean, like, these Baktrian assault infantry, their most admirable traits are definitely their offensive capabilities. So that's the thing, right? If you're using pretty, like, shock-style infantry, your slingers might not have enough time to dispel all of your ammunition. So I would stick with Peltis once you get like actual good Greek Peltis. The problem with these Baktrian Javelin men is they just don't have the melee stats to be all that useful once their Javelins are expended. But in any case, when it comes to your early moves, you're obviously just going to make an army and march on these guys. You should be able to beat them quite readily. And oh, I forgot one thing. When it comes to your early game recruitment, constantly check your mercenary tab, because in these two provinces, you'll occasionally get access to this Bactrian mercenary band. They are insanely good. It's like a 225 person armored axe unit. Their stats might look deceptively kind of mediocre, but if you look at their armor penetration, you'll realize that these guys just straight up ignore armor. And they're a 225 person unit. If you take that into account, their stats are actually quite good. I would definitely get those guys every chance that they pop up. But in any case, I'd recruit an army, I'd head down here, quickly beat these guys, and afterwards you have to worry about alliance systems. The thing is that the eastern factions along your border, they will quickly start forming alliance systems with each other, and these alliance systems are typically quite complicated. Like, you'll have like 3 or 4 factions in each alliance. So ultimately, you don't want to invoke the ire of an entire group of factions just because you want to take like one settlement. So I would just be extremely, extremely cautious about attacking. Always check the diplomacy tab and figure out who's allied with what, because the correct decision here isn't going to be like which settlements are more strategically viable, or I don't know, which ones are less defended. The reality is that you're going to want to attack whoever is not in an alliance. Pick off the weak links. Particularly in early game, a lot of these factions, like say Havaria here, they're a satrapy of the Seleucids. There's another faction down here that's a satrap with Seleucids, and as you go east, you see more and more satraps. When those guys break for satrapy agreements, they won't have any allies for a couple of turns. So, of course, you do want to pick those guys off before we get into these alliances, so you can more readily kill them later. Now, you are trading from the very onset with one faction, these guys. And these guys do quite... Actually, no, never mind. But you are trading with these guys, which is good, but Saka will probably come down to wipe them out. Now, these guys are along your border, Dadaha. And you can get a trade agreement with them on turn 1. It's always going to be high. I've never had them decline a trade agreement with me. And the thing is that if you get a trade agreement with these guys, you're going to be able to befriend the Parthians, who, while they don't seem like much right now, they will spread throughout the region with a ferocity unmatched by almost anything else in the game other than Rome. Parthia is destined to ascend in Divide et Impera. They just conquer everything that they touch. So if you do make friends with Adaha, you can quite easily befriend the Parthians and start getting agreements from them. So if you do want to kind of play goody-goody with the Parthians, you can do that, but simultaneously, you might not want to. You might just want to take them out before they become too strong, because at the end of the day, you're Greek or Persian. You will eventually come to despise each other, and God, that guy has a weird face, but in any case, that's kind of the way it is with the Parthians. You will eventually go to war with them at some point. So you can take them out early, or you can befriend them early and take care of them later. It's really up to you. Now, when it comes to your early game resources, you do start out with a couple. You have a silk here in Bukhara, and you have gold here in Uratidia. Okay, I can't pronounce that, but regardless, you have gold over here, which might be a very good thing to invest in, but at the same time, you have horrible public order that will deteriorate rapidly as the turns go by. It does take a while for you to develop a strong Greek population base. I mean, this province has 0 Greek culture. This one, you're still in the minority compared to Persians, and you are rising fast, but at the same time, it is going to take some time. So you can develop gold here or a temple if you want to accelerate this all-important process. But what I would recommend is that you build gold here, because gold just gives you so much money over time. It's hard to really pass up the opportunity to get some gold. And you build your temple here once you conquer it. You might have to suffer for a rebellion because of his order of operations, but ultimately it's worth it. And just build your amphitheater over here. Try to get public order a little bit more stable. But in any case, these are my advices for early game. Take these guys out, be wary of the alliance structures forming around you, and choose your targets accordingly. Now, let's look at the buffs and debuffs that the Baktrians have. Now, when it comes to the buffs and debuffs the Baktrians have, they have the standard Diadochi buffs, which is a negative 20% resistance to foreign occupation, so your foreign populations won't bug you as much. Although, because your foreign populations, you're the foreign occupier, but because your foreign populations are so strong in Baktria, this won't really impact you all that much in early game. You're going to have horrible public order either way, but over time, this is definitely going to make its impact felt. Simultaneously, a plus 10 morale for all units during battles against Hellenic factions. This is not going to be all that useful in your campaign unless you end up fighting the Seleucids, but truthfully, the Seleucids will probably get destroyed before you even get that far west in the map, since you're in the far east. You might end up fighting the Ptolemies at some point, but to be fair, the Baktrians just aren't in a very Hellenic cultured area, You're all the way in the east. You're surrounded in Persian territory, so I wouldn't really rely on this doing a whole lot. Now, when it comes to Baktria specific stuff, you have some very strong buffs. Increased cultural conversion, very useful considering the constant culture problems you're going to have. And of course, increased wealth from industrial and commerce buildings is so good, especially because you do have access to so many resources, so this is going to bump up your income steadily. Now, you do suffer from a major diplomatic penalty with all nomadic tribes, and there are quite a few nomadic tribes to your north. These guys are going to act as the perpetual invaders, coming into your lands and just being an overall nuisance, while also being too remote for you to want to conquer. But at the end of the day, the Baktrians did get destroyed in real life by nomadic invaders, so this makes perfect sense. It's very on brand for the Baktrians, and it kind of enhances immersion in a sense, I think anyway. But to be fair, you do have access to pretty good skirmishers, so you can get rid of the nomadic tribes if you want to. It's really just up to you. Now let's look at Baktria's phenomenal unit roster. Now, Baktria gives you a solid mix between Eastern and Hellenic cultures. It gives you extremely effective cavalry, actually phenomenal cavalry. Great missile infantry, although this missile infantry is more elite at the top tier for sure. Your low tier skirmishers are painfully average, but your top tier skirmishers are excellent, as well as some solid Greek style infantry. But also the infantry does have a sort of maybe not even Eastern, but kind of a barbaric vibe to it, because at the end of the day you are kind of a far-flung colony, and a lot of the settlers in Baktria weren't like pure-blooded Macedonians. Some did get left by were like the direct descendants of Alexander's veterans, but simultaneously there's a kind of a lot of troublemakers that were resettled to this area, as well as Greek peoples from Persia that had kind of mixed with local populations. So these guys aren't super duper Greek. They aren't the Greekiest of the Greeks for sure. Shouldn't be a surprise given where they are. So you do get some infantry that's rather quirky and much more offensively minded than most Greek infantry is. But first, let's start with the generals. So for early game, you have two choices here. You either have your Yarvana Guard or your Greco-Bactrian Noble Cavalry. The Yarvana Guard is a elite hoplite. They are generic elite hoplite. They don't do better than the average hoplite, but they're better than the ones that are worse, such as the Scythian Noble hoplites, the Molossian Royal Guard. Like, there's a couple of hoplites that'll only give you 35 armor, but these guys give you the 38 armor that you'd expect. They are extremely effective in this region because you're facing a lot of Eastern infantry that really isn't up to par. But simultaneously, the enemies will probably have a lot of skirmishers and stuff like that, and a lot of cavalry, and it is a little bit of a risk to have your general in an infantry unit, especially a pretty immobile one like this, just because they could quite easily get caught and surrounded, and that 38 armor isn't going to save them forever. So I wouldn't really use these guys unless you're making a more defensive army, but these guys are also cheaper than your cavalry to maintain by like 100 talons a turn. So if that's a consideration for you, then you can chance these guys, but just because Eastern style battles tend to be a lot looser, there's a lot more spacing between units, it isn't really the crash of two tightly wound lines like it is with Greek armies crashing. I feel like hoplites do a little bit worse in these styles of battles. They end up usually being surrounded and take a lot of casualties, so be wary about using these. Your Greco-Bactrian Noble Cavalry is excellent. They give you all the stats that you'd expect from an elite Lancer unit. Your 15 attack, your 60 charge, a good 41 armor, some bonus there's infantry, some bonus there's cavalry, some armor penetration. I mean, these guys are about as good as a companion style cavalry can get, with the exception of only being 75 men. They're not like the Sacred Squadron of Macedon, but that's like a once in the game unit, so can't really say much about these guys. These guys are excellent, use them. Now, as you get into late game, this is actually going to be a very familiar theme in your campaign. You get a horse archer. You get a horse archer instead of your kind of Macedonian style cavalry. You kind of go native in a sense. But these guys are worse at melee than your Macedonian style cavalry because they do have less melee attack and they have 9 less charge. Your weapon damage is also actually exactly the same. But what you do gain, of course, is a 17 missile damage, 160 range, 7 shots per minute, 15 ammunition archer, a horse archer, which is actually kind of decent. That's reasonable. Like, these guys are slightly better than your typical horse archer, while also offering some pretty decent cavalry stats. Not like super elite melee stats, but very, very competent melee stats. So these guys are good as like a hybrid, but I don't know, I don't find myself using like hybrid units that are mass capacity. Like, when I see a unit like this, I usually find I'm going to want to charge them anyway, and I don't think I'll end up using much of the ammunition, which would honestly make this Greco-Noble Cavalry a little bit more useful to me personally, but that's just my opinion. Now, when it comes to your melee infantry, you have here your completely crappy militia-style unit. Now, these guys aren't completely useless because they have 24 charge bonus, so they can do damage on the flank and they'll completely ignore armor, but they'll rarely score a hit. They have horrible morale, they'll rout instantly, and no armor. So these guys will get absolutely obliterated by anything. They're not a stable type of levy at all. But they will annihilate skirmishers if you charge these guys into skirmishers, and they can hit a good flank, and they are extremely cheap. So use them if you're desperate. Now, I already talked about the Bactrian assault infantry. These are the Thracians of northern India and Afghanistan. These guys literally are almost identical to early Thracian infantry, which is really, really sick. They do great on a charge. They do die in long-term combat, as you'd expect, but also the Bactrian assault infantry is a medium melee infantry, while the Thracian one is a light, which is why these guys have no ammunition, I guess. This is kind of the buff. So actually, they are more stable than the Thracian ones, which, again, just makes them even better. Use these guys. This is going to be your like first army's main line, and they are a relatively reliable unit, despite what the armor will tell you. And they do kill a lot in battle, too. Your Sogdian Axemen are an X factor. This attack combined with this killer charge bonus makes these guys exceptionally lethal on a charge. I mean, you get these guys to hit a flank, they kill everything. Now, when these guys don't get their charge, they die like flies. So that's really the trade-off with these guys. Use them as flanking troops, but don't use them as a main line. Now, once you hit the Furnos Reforms, you get an upgrade to your Greco-Bactrian assault infantry. Wait a minute, what's going on? These guys become a light unit. They become a light unit. But this is Huh, that's actually weird, because But this is definitely the more expensive version. Now that is a peculiar thing. So I feel like the Baktrian roster has changed a little bit since I played my last campaign with him, and I was examining this before the video, of course, but I didn't catch that detail. But these guys are definitely a Furrows version, which is just odd. But they are identically fast to the Baktrian Assault Infantry, which is a medium melee infantry. But when you really just look at their statistics, their raw statistics, these guys are better in every capacity. Better attack, better defense, better charge, better weapon damage. Yeah, same bonus as infantry and armor penetration because they use some axes, but they have better armor as well. They have almost double the armor of your original guys and more morale, as well as they get a javelin volley. So these guys become more versatile, although because of their light stature, they might be a little bit more vulnerable to cavalry. Although they do have better stats, so they might not die as quickly, but yeah, it's a peculiar thing to go from medium to light, but I guess they just wanted to become more flexible. Now, looking at this Marian Warrior Guildsman, I do have to admit, this unit is kinda mediocre, but they do have the highest weapon damage of any unit that you have, even higher than your Sogdian Axemen. So these guys might be a little bit, it might just be like a little bit surprising, but all for other stats are mediocre. Like 30 armor is nothing special, 49 morale is nothing special. 3 speed is pretty good for a heavy melee infantry, but is a bit of an advantage. But 19 charge bonus is definitely nothing special. But the 28 weapon damage is surprising to me. I feel like these guys are going to be okay in combat, but they're hardly going to be exceptional. I wouldn't want to use these guys as a main line, but they are kind of a stable bet for holding flanks. They're also not very expensive by what I'm seeing here, so yeah, they're like a decent sword infantry, but again, like they're not like Roman-esque infantry. They're not like a 4x sword or anything. They'll pack more of a punch, but they'll also die a bit quicker than those type of units. Now, your Pisidian Settlers, this is a really interesting unit. It's very unique. They have a crazy charge bonus. They do insane armor penetration. Their weapon damage is decent. Not amazing, though. They also have pretty low armor for such an expensive unit. Only 20 armor is terrible for this price. And a base morale of 45, which is also nothing impressive, especially at this price range. I mean, you'll see that the Marian Warrior Guildsmen do better in both those regards. But it's an armor penetration. These guys are axemen that'll cleave straight through armor, and simultaneously they have 4 volleys of javelins and 4 speed, meaning that these guys are essentially a hybrid skirmisher that's really good for flanking. This is a really interesting style shock unit that just uses the javelins as really part of the charge effect rather than killing in melee as competently as a unit that wouldn't have these javelins. So these guys are really cool, man. They're kind of like a elite peltist axemen. It's a really weird unit. I would use these guys. They can absolutely inspire fear in your enemies. And it would be very interesting to use against a successor kingdom style faction, but just doesn't really have an equivalent unit. And you have 4x swords. Stable, dependable, not exceptional, but they'll get the job done. That's 4x swords in a nutshell. Elite unit, you have to wait until the end of the game to get it. Now, looking at your regular spears, you have your Bactrian levies. Nothing special about these levies, other than they are extremely cheap. Other than that, they're your generic levies. Then you also have Indian levy spears. These guys are a little bit better in combat than your typical levies, but they also do have horrendous morale, as you'd expect of a levy unit, but simultaneously, for a unit with the stats, the morale is really what brings these down, because they don't really have levy-like stats. At 8 melee attack and 11 melee defense is not bad for what is a really cheap unit. These guys are actually decent. They can be useful on the flanks to support your cavalry, although their bonus to cavalry is a little bit lower than some other spearmen would have. Now you have Furrow spears as well. You unlock them with the Furrow's Reforms. This is a perfectly average Furrow spear. It's better than some in the game because you have 20 armor. I've seen some with 10 armor. I've seen some with 15 armor. The better ones have 25 armor though, which is why these guys are average, but you know, it's a average Furrow spear. It's the same one the Seleucids have. It'll work. It'll do its job. Now you do have Baktrian infantry, and you can unlock this with like your second Barak. And the stats for this unit is actually pretty good. It's a really decent unit that'll offer some flexibility in your army. It's not exceptional, you're not going to be using these guys up for a late game, but they are probably the best unit you can have on your flank in early game. Like, if you have these guys supported with Baktrian Assault Infantry and Sogdian Axemen, they'll make an insane wombo combo. These guys coming in and kind of getting more flank attacks, while these guys take on the bulk of the enemy punishment. Now, for phalanxes, the Baktrians have decent phalanxes, but not excellent phalanxes. For hoplites are honestly the better part of our phalanx roster vote, because these hoplites are average. They have the same stats as virtually any other hoplite in the game. They're not worse, not better. The Yavanna Guard, same thing. Elite hoplite, typical elite hoplite stats. These pikes are a little bit weaker than most pikes, especially these Macedonian settlers. Your typical pike has 10 melee defense instead of 10. Your typical pike has 35 armor instead of 30. These are actually pretty weak pikes overall. Now, to be fair, you're not in a part of the map that's going to have strong adversity to these pikes. There's no other factions that have pikes in this area, so considering that they're pike-less, it doesn't really matter that your pikes are a little bit weaker. And once you get to your 4X reforms, you get pretty decent pikes. Like, these guys, the only difference between these guys and regular 4X pikemen is that these guys have 3 less armor, which is hardly going to be noticeable. On the battlefield, where terrain, when missiles, when all of these things make a difference, it's like barely anything a 3 armor is going to do. So once you get to late game, you're going to have competent pikemen. Until then, hoplites might actually be your better bet, because hoplites are better against missiles, and you're going to be going against Persians that have bad infantry but strong missile troops. So maybe you just want to deflect your missiles rather than have pikemen. Pikemen are a little bit overkill in this region, to be honest. Now for missile infantry, you have kind of mediocre early game missiles, but really strong late game missiles. And I'll show you what I mean. These Bactrian javelin men, javelins always do damage, guys, but these Bactrian javelin men are perfectly mediocre when it comes to javelin men. They're like not good, man. They're pretty bad for javelin men. For javelin men, I'm not saying like in general they're like horrible, but they have like no melee stats, they have no armor, they have bad range. They're bad, but they're extremely cheap. Next you get the Sogdian javelin men. These guys are direct upgrade in the sense that they have some melee stats. They still have terrible melee stats. I still wouldn't use them. Moving on, you have Baktrian archers. This is the most average archer that's ever lived. No armor, 165 range. They're not good. They're not good. They're not exceptionally bad or anything, but they're not good. And why would you use a unit that's really extremely average? If you want something better, go for the Baktrian slingers. These are actually pretty good slingers. They're not like elite slingers, like a Rhodian slinger or a Balearic slinger. They're nothing special, but they're akin to Judean slingers, they're akin to Celtic slingers, they're akin to the better normal slingers in the game. So they're kind of like a little bit of an upgrade. So I would use them. But keep in mind that you have a lot of shock troops, and slingers are maybe not the best complement to shock troops, because these guys take a while to kill, and these guys take a very short period of time to kill. You either want to go in hard and fast, or you want to go in slow and bleed them out, which is what the slingers are good for doing. Now you have the Sogdian Archer Spearmen. This is an area recruitment, but you have access to them right away. These guys, they're not good as archers. They're no better than these guys as archers, but they have a spear, so they're slightly better in melee, but still not good in melee. Not a whole lot of reason to recruit these guys. They're kind of a scam, just like the Persian elite archers are in the base game. Now moving on to Peltis. This is a unit I'd recommend that you bring. The Greco-Bactrian Peltis, because it actually has some decent melee stats, 21 weapon damage, 21 charge bonus. These guys will go in with a shock, just like your Bactrian assault infantry. So why not just bring these guys to throw some javelins and then basically double the assault in the line? I like it. Later in the game, you unlock the regular Bactrian Peltis. These guys are the same as regular Greek Peltis. They just kind of become a lot more armored. Some better range, a little bit better missiles. They just become better. And that's good. It helps them keep up in late game. Now, for late game, once you have 4X reforms, you get these 2 archer units. You get your Cretan Settlers and your Marian Bowmen. Now, the Cretan Settlers, they're kind of like a machine gun, man. They're like an ancient machine gun. They shoot so fast, 9 shots per minute. And their arrows do a lot of damage, but also, the arrows have a pathetic range of only 150. You have to get in nice close and personal, but these guys will expend their 15 ammunition in less than 2 minutes and just kill a unit by itself. Now, admittedly, their melee stats are not horrible, but they're nothing special. Particularly in late game, I feel like even though these guys have better melee stats than a lot of archers, these stats will be outdated by then. So I wouldn't really use it, but if you want better melee stats, get the Marians. In fact, I would just go for the Marians straight up. Sure, these guys don't shoot as quickly, but they have 215 range. These guys are like a ballista. These guys have the longest archer range in the game. I would use them. A super special, super interesting unit. Use these Indian bowmen. They will serve you faithfully. I prefer them over the Cretans any day of the week. Now moving on to your cavalry. As I said, you have excellent cavalry as the Baktrians. This is where about kind of Eastern style-ish infantry meets definitely Eastern inspired cavalry. Now, for your early game, we're going to have a couple of units here, like the Baktrian nobles, Baktrian horse archer, Baktrian light cavalry, kind of like this little block here. Now, for your Baktrian cavalry, these guys, they are kind of your typical early game cavalry, although they do count as a medium cavalry from the very onset. A very interesting unit. Very interesting unit because they have 12 armor penetration, which is really weird for shock cavalry, and 19 weapon damage. But they also don't have crazy charge bonus. They come in with 90 men though, which is also kind of cool. This is a unique unit overall. I feel like even though it says shock cavalry, these guys are definitely more for long-term fights with infantry rather than shock, or long-term fights with cavalry. I mean, look at this. Bonus with infantry, 3. Armor penetration, 12. These guys are like... This is a cavalry unit designed to get stuck in with infantry and just go at it. I don't know how useful that's going to be, especially in the east where you have a lot of low armor spearmen. I feel like these guys would get gutted, but that's what they're for. Baktrian nobles, these guys are once again kind of interesting. Look at that armor penetration. Look at that weapon damage, and look at that melee attack. But also look at that charge of 56, that's really good, but similarly, these guys are probably going to be good at staying stuck in with infantry too, just like these guys. These aren't as... Because of that melee attack, they're not going to be as good at a rear charge. But to be fair, with 56 charge bonus, they can still rear charge really well, and we're heavy, so they can still rear charge pretty well. Your Greco-Bactrian noble cavalry, these guys are more for hammer and anvil though. These guys are kind of more fancy, these guys are more for hammer and anvil. And moving on, you also get cataphracts. I think you get these guys... Well, no, you get these guys in late game. You get these guys, I think, with maybe Feroce or something. But you do have cataphracts. They are more expensive than your Greco-Bactrian nobles. If they actually have worse stats, you do get more armor. And you become very heavy, but also that loses you speed. Which I think is actually really important, because imagine how many horse archers you might be fighting around you. I wouldn't really go for these cataphracts. These cataphracts are nothing compared to Parthian cataphracts too. I mean, just look at the stats that you lose. Like, these guys become worse at fighting. So, like, you really do pay for that armor and that heavier charge. These guys will definitely charge heavier. Even though their charge bonus is less, will do more damage just because of their mass. That's a trade-off between these two. You just have to choose whichever one you want. Now, your Bactrian heavy cataphract, that's just late game. And because these guys are super late game, the art is better than both of these. Sure, we don't have your 15 melee attack, but we don't even have the 13 melee attack of these guys. But look at their melee defense. Like, these guys actually become extremely competent in cavalry on cavalry battles, which you cannot excuse that. Like, these guys will get chopped down if they get charged by good melee cavalry. These guys, they'll stand up. They'll stand up and they'll kill the enemy melee cavalry with ease. Also, 67 charge bonus is crazy. So your Bactrian heavy cavalry cataphracts, these guys are like an elephant on the charge. I definitely use them. They're also super heavy instead of very heavy. These guys are absolutely massive. Now looking at your missile cavalry, this is where you get some interesting troops. Of course, Bactrian light cavalry and Bactrian horse archers, these are kind of generic horse archers and light cavalry. Same thing with Sogdian cavalry riders. These guys have horrible combat stats, but they will scare enemy horses, but also, like, they're pretty fast for camels at like 7 speed, but also slower than generic cavalry. I don't know, I never really used camels a whole lot, but these guys, I think that the 4 armor just makes them kind of pathetic. Like, these guys will get shot by anything and just obliterated. Now moving on, there's Greco-Bactrian cavalry. Look at these guys. 49 charge bonus. isn't much, right? You think, okay, 24 charge bonus is kind of bad. 11 melee attack's not good. And these guys shoot javelins, by the way, or javelin unit. But look at their weapon damage. It's 27, guys. These guys are absolutely massive in combat, kind of like your Baktrian nobles. Except these guys also have a bunch of javelins. Wait, no. I'm talking about the Urvana heroic cavalry. Sorry, that wasn't the wrong one. But okay, that all applies to the Urvana heroic cavalry. These guys have obscene weapon damage at 31. Okay, at 31. Compare that to the 29 here. These guys are insanely effective in combat. I tested them out in a custom battle. You'll be surprised by how much these guys can kill in cavalry on cavalry. And considering that they have a beautiful 6 javelins, right, do 23 damage each, elite javelins. These guys are just insanely good. And 95 range is really good for javelin unit too. These guys basically throw over javelins and they just kill and kill and kill. They don't do a lot of the charge, but if you just get them in any combat with like cavalry, they will slice them up. Unless they're just like super heavy Parthian cataphracts or something. And then these two, the Greco-Bactrian light cavalry and the Greco-Bactrian cavalry, this is that hybrid shock cavalry archer. A little bit worse than shock cavalry, but you basically get a very competent elite horse archer too. If you like these type of hybrids, use them. I like to keep it simple. I like to have my cavalry for skirmishing, and I like to have my cavalry for shocking. I don't really like my, my jack of all trades, but you might, and you might make use of it. Now, for your beasts of war, you have the best elephants in the game. You have your Indian elephants. Yes, the Marian variation, they do have like some Indian elephants that have better armor, have cooler armor. But these Indian elephants are still extremely good and a viable and usable part of your roster. Like, if you like elephants, you're going to love these elephants. They're so much better than the Ptolemaic elephants. This is the good shit elephant. These are the type of elephants that Epirus has. Make use of them, guys. They will be super effective. Now for my verdict here, I would say that the roster is extremely powerful. Just this mix of very useful cavalry combined with some competent missile troops, as well as some extremely cost-effective and interesting infantry. I feel like I'd give this roster a solid 9 out of 10 when it comes to power. I'd say that they're actually extremely underrated in that you really have everything here. I mean, you have the best archer unit in the game that you can make use of. Really good cavalry, and then you have the archetypes for some extremely good infantry. Maybe not the best versions, but if you can make these guys, if you can use these guys effectively, they're like a 9 out of 10, or maybe an 8.5, I would say. Kind of leaning more towards 8.5 and 9. Now, looking at their start position is very interesting, and you just have this extremely unique experience of being a complete foreign power deep within Persian lands, which is kind of cool. And because of that, I feel like this is a campaign that you should play. So for how much you should play this campaign, I give it a solid 8 out of 10. I feel like you really should play this campaign. It's extremely fun, and also it's just really beginner friendly. So if you're kind of newer to this mod, the Bactrian start just kind of gives you a lot of laxity. You don't have to worry so much about doing everything perfectly if you play the Bactrians, unlike maybe the Seleucids or the Ptolemies that are a bigger target right from the beginning. Now, looking at the difficulty level, I definitely wouldn't say that this is a very hard faction, as long as you recruit these guys from the very beginning. Doing anything else would be a mistake, but as long as you kind of like figure out the early roster, you can definitely smash with these guys. So I'd say in terms of difficulty, it's like a solid 2 out of 10. It's really not a hard faction to use. You have to make some pretty catastrophic diplomatic errors to really lose with these guys, or just get slammed by the Parthians. But there we have it, guys. This is Baktria. I highly recommend you try it. It's a really cool campaign, and I hope you have fun with it. Anyway, that's it for this guide. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.